Hello everybody, welcome to the Scroll Ensemble Classical Music Improvisation channel. I'm Robert. This video is the conclusion to our diminution challenge. We're going to compare lots of versions, but feel free also to take up the challenge of subscribing to our channel or supporting us on Patreon. Lots of freebies to come later on in the video, so something to consider. The idea of diminutions, very shortly, is to learn little patterns by heart which you use to ornament a simpler melody. So a slower, longer note becomes several faster, shorter notes. Simultaneously, by variation, we can generate new, similar patterns from the ones we have learned. But how do we use them? In the challenge, we have been using Ung Gay Bergier as our simple melody. In the past, several musicians also wrote down their versions of Ung Gay Bergier with diminutions. So we could consider those recordings of their improvisations and use them to learn more about how to use these patterns. Here's a playlist with recordings, and in this video I'm going to first go through some general observations and questions, and then pass by each diminuted version for further remarks. Here you can see the general questions that I will look at. And maybe finally a small remark, I've only looked at the part of Ung Gay Bergier which we've used for our challenge practice. If you want more, you should just let me know in the comments and I'll happily oblige. We find these versions in two types of books, of materials. Firstly, in books specifically devoted to learning diminutions, ornamentation, like the books by Dalla Casa, Rogniono and Bassano. These books teach patterns for improvisation. Similar to Banchieri, they give a little bit of melody and then different ways to diminute that melody. And some of these books then give us several famous vocal pieces, like madrigals, that people used to improvise on using these patterns, and give us an example of what a full improvisation might look like. In other cases, we find versions in collections of playing pieces, like the versions by Cabezon, Gabrieli or Arauxo. It was typical for instrumentalists who could play several notes, like harpists, lutists and keyboardists at the same time, to take vocal music and perform or publish it with diminutions. Indeed, the practice books I mentioned teach you how to improvise these diminutions by knowing a lot of patterns and knowing the original music inside out. Although they don't teach you how to know this music inside out, they just knew it. So it will not have been hard for these musicians to write down a version of what they improvised. We could wonder though, did the improvisers think more about these versions and spend more time composing them because they were going to be published? We will never know, but I guess that is likely. The learning books often state in the title that they are for any instrument, which often includes also the voice. The versions of Ung Gay Bergier are for a keyboard instrument, harp, melodic instrument, lute, etc. Sadly, all the lute versions are in tablature, and it took me too long to figure those out for now. So if you are a lute player and feel like transcribing some of these in modern notation because we are missing out, I will be very happy and add them to the PDF with all the versions that I made, a sort of combination PDF. And you can find a link to that in the description. We have three types of diminutions: for melodic instrument, bastarda and for keyboard instrument. The melodic instrument diminutions focus on the top voice, the soprano usually, and they will often have someone else or an ensemble perform the other parts of the original piece. The bastarda version is usually still played on a melodic instrument, sometimes on a bass instrument, but still one that plays mostly one note at the same time, but jumps from one part to the other, like a sort of patchwork, making therefore a new melody. Diminutions are therefore applied to different voices, because there are bits of these different voices in this new melody, though there is often a focus on the top and lowest parts. Here too there will be some version of the original played by someone else. The keyboard versions are obviously for keyboard instruments, although sometimes they're also played by instrumentalists like harpists. They play almost all of the parts and all of the notes of the original by themselves. Diminutions can then be found in all parts, but again, most often in the top and lowest part. In general, we see that most diminutions start off simpler at the beginning of the piece and then get more complex. That is, they might start with just eighth notes and then add in faster notes. We also see that most phrases start without a diminution, and that in later phrases we might find more diminutions per phrase. In the Bastarda versions, it seems to be important that the listener can grasp which voice part is being played, and then to highlight certain imitations between those voices. For example, when the soprano voice starts with a certain phrase and it is then later imitated by the tenor, Bastarda versions like to first start with that soprano and then jump to the tenor. Both parts are often less ornamented or even not ornamented at all, so we can really hear this imitation and that these two parts are the same. In the keyboard versions we see more diminutions in general, sometimes even more or less from beginning to start, because the diminutions can happen in any part and are also used to make the music more vocal and flowing. In the case of Ung Gay Bergier, diminutions are still mostly only in one voice, except for a few moments which we can find in Cabezon. To my sensibilities, there is not really any word painting or expression of specific emotions or images in the text. It being a simple text with not much of an exciting plot, I suppose that only makes sense. But perhaps you disagree, and I'd love to hear that in the comments. In general, we find mostly the same ideas as we found in Banchieri, that is, the same type of rhythms and intervals. But there are also some unexpected special ideas, especially in Rogniono. Dalla Casa uses an interesting rhythm for the cadence. Here it's a sextuplet. And this rhythm by Bassano also kind of jumps out specifically within the context of Bassano's simpler usage of rhythm. More interestingly, we can see differences in how far the improvisers go away from the original melody, in terms of interval. Bassano stays quite close and mostly goes farther away under the melody, but only once to an octave and then quickly makes his way back. Otherwise it's mostly seconds, thirds and fifths and mostly diatonic scale-like figurations. In contrast, even in the melodic version, Rogniono once spans even an 11th in just 2 beats. But Rogniono also plays a lot with variety, so some phrases look more conservative even than Bassano in terms of interval span. How far away, in which direction the improviser goes, and how this is varied is also an important part of what makes this style and the specific improviser's style. I think therefore that it is not enough to just learn the patterns, but the next interesting step is to learn how to use them. I also would like to point out that Banchieri uses slurs in several of his diminutions. Perhaps this doesn't mean much to us now, but many diminution treatises, learning books, teach that all notes should be articulated, even for the very, very fast passages. For example, the ones by wind players talk about a dead tongue, lingua morte, when you don't articulate. And that's not meant as a good thing. Banchieri is, of course, aware of this and says in a little footnote that he explains this modern practice elsewhere. But it's good to know that there is this difference. I thought it was interesting to see if there are perhaps bars or moments or ideas that are totally the same for all these versions. The most similar thing is where there are no diminutions, or perhaps a correspondence between no diminutions and very simple diminutions. Otherwise, except for 2 beats in bar 24 and the ending of 26, it's basically all different. And even in the similar moments, small variations often occur, which I think is a testament to how many possibilities there are. And perhaps even actually suggests that musicians actively pursued developing their own style.